They cut down my trees, and they didn't even bother to ask. So I did something most people would call insane. I took away something they didn't even realize they depended on. And the worst part is, they still think I overreacted. I remember the exact moment I knew something was wrong, not because of what I saw, but because of what I didn't hear. You get used to certain sounds when you live out in the country long enough. Wind moving through leaves, branches creaking, that soft hush that settles over everything in the late afternoon. And when I pulled into my driveway that day, it was just gone. Too quiet. Like someone had muted the land. I stepped out of my truck and just stood there for a second, keys still in my hand, and I swear it felt like the air itself had been stripped bare. Then I looked up, or at least I tried to, because where there used to be this thick canopy of maple trees, tall ones, 30 feet easy, planted by my grandfather before I was even born, there was nothing but open sky and a jagged line of stumps stretching along the edge of my property like a bad scar. I didn't move at first. I couldn't. My brain was trying to catch up to something my eyes already understood, and when it finally hit me, it hit hard, like a punch that lands a second after you see it coming. I walked over slowly, boots crunching on sawdust that hadn't even had time to settle yet, and I ran my hand over one of the stumps, still warm from the cut, rings exposed like years of history just laid out and erased in the same breath. Those trees weren't just trees, they were shade in the summers, windbreak in the winters, privacy from the world creeping closer every year. They were part of the land, part of my family. My grandfather used to tell me he planted them, so whoever came after him would always have a little piece out here, a little buffer between them, and whatever nonsense the world decided to throw their way. Turns out, he underestimated how far that nonsense would reach. Taped to one of the stumps was this laminated notice, bright white, official-looking, the kind of thing meant to make something ugly sound reasonable. It said the trees had been removed under a neighborhood improvement ordinance because they were obstructing sightlines. Sightlines. I actually laughed when I read that, not because it was funny, but because it was so absurd it didn't feel real. There is no ordinance out here. No HOA. No shared easement. That line of trees sat well inside my property boundary, always had. Which meant whoever did this either didn't care about the law or thought I wouldn't push back. That's when I turned and looked past the stumps, out toward the ridge behind my place. And there it was, the new development. 6 months ago, it was just dirt and survey flags. Now it was rows of big, clean houses, all painted in those soft, neutral colors developers love, with trimmed lawns, decorative stone, and those identical little saplings they plant to pretend a place has history. I'd kept to myself since they moved in, waved once or twice if I saw someone out front, but mostly I stayed on my side and let them stay on theirs. Those trees had been the line, the natural wall that kept their world and mine from rubbing up against each other. Without them, everything felt exposed. I could see straight into their backyards now, and they could see straight into mine. That's when the anger really started to settle in, slow and heavy, like something sinking to the bottom of a lake. Not loud, not explosive, just steady. I walked the length of the stumps, and that's when I noticed the tracks, deep grooves pressed into the soil from heavy equipment, crossing over from their side into mine like it was all the same to them. And a few feet away, half buried under loose dirt, there was a crumpled piece of paper, looked like it had fallen out of someone's pocket. I picked it up, brushed it off, and sure enough, invoice from a tree service company, header printed with the name of the subdivision's management group, Crest Hollow Estates. That's when everything clicked into place, not just what they did, but why. Those houses sit up just enough that if you clear the trees, you get a perfect view of the hills to the west. Sunset view. That's what this was about. Not safety, not ordnance, just a better picture to look at in the evening. I stood there holding that invoice, feeling something shift inside me, not just anger, but clarity. Because here's the thing they didn't know, something most people wouldn't even think to ask about. The wide stretch of green space behind their houses, the one with the playground, the picnic tables, that little fountain they all seem so proud of. That land runs right along an irrigation line my family put in decades ago, fed by a private well that sits on my property, about 50 yards from my back porch. Back when the land was still all pasture, my dad let the previous owner tap into that line. Nothing formal, just a handshake and a promise to share the upkeep. And when the developers bought the land, that arrangement just carried over. No contract, no paperwork, just assumption. I remember my dad saying once, Sometimes it's easier to be neighborly than it is to be right. He believed in that. I used to think he was right too. But standing there, staring at those stumps, I realized something. Being neighborly only works when both sides remember the deal. And in that moment, it was pretty clear they didn't. So I turned around, walked back to the house, set the invoice down on the kitchen counter, and just stood there for a minute, looking out the window toward the pump house. Small building, nothing fancy, just wood siding, a metal roof, and a lock on the door that hadn't been changed in years because no one had ever given me a reason to. Until now. I grabbed my keys, headed back outside, and as I walked across the yard, I could feel that quiet again, heavier this time. Not peaceful, not empty, just waiting. I remember the sound of that pump house door more than anything else. The hinge gave this long, slow creak when I pulled it open, like it hadn't been disturbed in years, and in a way, it hadn't, not really. That place had always been more of a background thing in my life, something that just worked quietly without needing attention, like the kind of relationship you don't think about until it's tested. Inside, it smelled faintly of oil and damp wood, the old control panel still mounted on the wall, a row of labeled valves running along the base like they'd been waiting patiently for someone to make a decision. I stood there for a second, hand resting on one of the levers, and I'll be honest, I hesitated. Not because I didn't know what I was about to do, but because I did. There's a moment, right before you cross a line, where everything feels reversible, like you could still walk away and pretend none of it happened. But once you move, once you commit, there's no going back to how things were before. I thought about my dad then, the way he used to shrug things off, how he believed in giving people the benefit of the doubt, and I wondered what he would have said if he'd seen those trees. I don't think he would have recognized this version of the situation. Or maybe he would have, and he just wouldn't have said it out loud. Either way, I tightened my grip, and I pulled the first valve shut. It wasn't dramatic, no big moment, just a dull metallic thunk as the flow cut off. Then the second, then the third. Each one felt quieter than the last, but heavier somehow, like I was stacking consequences one on top of another. After that, I moved to the auxiliary tanks and drained them down, watched the pressure gauges drop slowly to zero. I didn't rush it. If anything, I took my time, making sure there wasn't a single drop left moving through that line toward their side. When I finally stepped back outside, the sun was starting to dip low, and for the first time since I got home, I noticed the sky, wide open now, nothing blocking it, nothing filtering that harsh, direct light. Funny thing is, I didn't even look at the sunset. I just locked the pump house and walked back to the porch like it was any other evening. The first day, nothing really changed. You wouldn't expect it to. Grass doesn't die overnight, and fountains don't stop the second you turn off a line. There's always a delay, a kind of grace period where everything still looks normal on the surface. But by the second day, I could already see it starting. That bright, even green in their shared yard had dulled just enough to notice if you knew what you were looking for. The fountain was still running, but weaker, like it was struggling to keep up the illusion. I didn't go over there, didn't say anything. I just went about my routine, fixed a section of fence, checked on the garden, made coffee, and sat on the porch a little longer than usual. Every now and then, I'd catch myself glancing toward their side, not out of curiosity, but out of confirmation. Like I needed to see it happening to believe it was real. By day 3, the change was obvious. Patches of brown started creeping in along the edges of the lawn, the kind that spreads unevenly, like a stain you can't quite contain. I noticed fewer people outside too, no kids running around, no couples walking the paths in the evening. It's funny how quickly a place can lose its appeal when something small goes wrong. Or maybe it wasn't small, maybe it just looked that way at first. I was out by the mailbox that afternoon when I saw a couple standing near the fence line, looking over toward my property. They didn't wave, just stood there, talking in low voices, pointing every now and then. I gave them a nod anyway, out of habit more than anything. But they turned away before I could tell if they noticed. Day 4 was when everything tipped. I woke up early, same as always, poured myself a cup of coffee, and stepped out onto the porch, and there it was. The fountain had stopped completely. No trickle, no movement, just a dry basin sitting in the middle of a yard that now looked more tan than green. The playground, the one with the bright plastic slides and those rubber mats underneath, had already started to gather dust, little clouds kicking up whenever someone walked across it. And there were kids out there, a few of them, dragging their feet, confused more than anything. One of them tried to turn the fountain handle, probably thinking it was broken, and when nothing happened, he just stood there for a second, then walked back toward the houses. That part, I'll admit, that sat with me longer than I expected. Not enough to change my mind, but enough to make me aware of what this was turning into. Because this wasn't just about trees anymore. It was about leverage. It didn't take long after that. Around mid-morning, I heard a car pull up fast on the gravel, tires crunching harder than necessary, and then footsteps, quick, deliberate, heading straight for the porch. I didn't have to look to know who it was. I'd seen her once before at a distance, giving directions to a landscaping crew like she owned the place, which, in her mind, she probably did. Dana Whitaker, president of the Crest Hollow Homeowners Board. She didn't knock, just stopped a few feet from the steps, arms crossed, posture stiff like she'd already decided how this conversation was going to go. "You need to turn the water back on," she said. No greeting, no introduction, just straight to it. Voice sharp enough to cut through whatever patience I might have had left. I took a sip of my coffee before answering, not to stall, but because I wasn't in any hurry. "Morning," I said, setting the mug down on the railing. "Something wrong with your system?" Her jaw tightened at that. "Don't play games. We know that line runs through your property. You don't have the right to just shut it off without notice." I stepped inside for a second, grabbed the folder I'd pulled together the night before, and came back out, sliding it across the small table between us. "You might want to take a look at that before you tell me what I do and don't have the right to do." She hesitated, just for a second, then opened it, flipping through the pages, survey maps, property boundaries, documentation that hadn't mattered to anyone until now. I watched her expression shift, not dramatically, but enough. Confidence cracking just a little at the edges. This doesn't change the fact that people live here," she said, softer now, but still trying to hold her ground. "We have families, kids, shared spaces that depend on that water. And I had trees," I replied, calm, steady. 30-foot maples that were on my land. No notice, no permission, just gone. She exhaled sharply, like she'd been expecting resistance, but not this kind. "That was handled through a contractor under the assumption that I wouldn't do anything about it." I cut in, not raising my voice, just tightening it enough to make the point land. There was a pause then, the kind where both sides realized the conversation isn't going to go the way they planned. She closed the folder slowly, set it back down, and looked at me like she was recalibrating. "What do you want?" she asked finally. That question hung there for a second, heavier than anything she'd said so far. Because the truth was, this wasn't about what I wanted anymore. That part had already been taken. This was about what I was willing to accept. "I've already filed a report," I said, meeting her gaze. "Property destruction. Trespass. I've got an arborist coming out to assess the value of what was cut down, and I've started the process for a civil suit. Triple damages, given the circumstances." Her eyes widened just a fraction. "That's excessive." "No," I said quietly. "What's excessive is walking onto someone else's land and cutting down decades of growth because it blocks your sunset." She didn't have an answer for that. Not right away. Instead, she glanced past me, toward the empty stretch where the trees used to stand, like she was seeing it for the first time from my side. "You're really going to let everything over there die over this?" she asked, a hint of disbelief creeping in now. I followed her gaze, took in the dry fountain, the fading grass, the quiet playground, then looked back at her. "That depends," I said, "on how seriously you take what you've already killed." And that's when I knew this wasn't just a disagreement anymore. This was a standoff. She stood there for a moment like she wanted to say something else, like there was still some version of this conversation where she could walk away feeling in control, but that version was gone. You could see it in her posture, the way her shoulders dropped just slightly, the way her eyes shifted from me to the yard and back again, recalculating. People like Dana aren't used to being on the back foot, not in their own neighborhood, not in front of someone they assumed would just fold under pressure. But the truth is, this was never really her neighborhood, not the way mine was. They built their homes on top of something that already existed, something they didn't take the time to understand, and now they were learning, the hard way. That land remembers who it belongs to. "I'll talk to the board," she said finally, voice tighter now, less certain. "We'll figure something out." I nodded once. "You do that." She turned without another word, walked back to her car, and drove off slower than she arrived, like she needed the extra time to think. I watched her disappear down the road, then sat back down in my chair, picked up my coffee, and took a long sip. It had gone cold, but I didn't mind. Something about the stillness felt different now, not empty like before, but settled, like a storm that hadn't passed, just shifted direction. Over the next few days, things escalated in ways that felt almost predictable once they started. At first, it was just more people coming by, not as confrontational as Dana, but not exactly friendly either. A couple of homeowners stopped at the edge of the property, trying to sound reasonable, asking if there had been some kind of misunderstanding. One guy even brought up property values, like that was supposed to mean something to me. I listened, nodded where it felt appropriate, but I didn't offer anything back. No promises, no timelines. Just the same quiet acknowledgement that, yes, the water was off, and no, it wasn't coming back on anytime soon. By the end of the week, the pressure had shifted inward on their side. You could see it from a distance, groups of people gathered near the dry fountain, conversations that looked more heated with each passing day. I caught snippets when the wind carried their voices over, words like board, liability, lawsuit, getting thrown around like they were trying to assign blame fast enough to outrun the consequences. And in the middle of it all, that yard kept getting worse. The grass didn't just turn brown, it started to crisp, breaking underfoot, patches of dirt expanding until the whole place looked like something abandoned. The playground emptied out completely after a while. No point playing in dust. One afternoon, about a week in, I heard the low hum of a drone overhead. I looked up and sure enough, there it was, hovering just high enough to stay out of reach, camera angled down toward their shared space. I didn't need to guess who sent it. I'd already forwarded my own footage to a local news contact I knew from years back, someone who owed my dad a favor from way before my time. I hadn't asked for anything dramatic, just told him there might be a story worth looking into: private property, unauthorized tree removal, community fallout. Turns out, that was enough. The segment aired 2 nights later. Short, maybe 3 minutes, but it didn't need to be longer. They showed the stumps, the boundary lines, the dry fountain, kids' toys sitting untouched in a yard that looked like it had been forgotten. They even included a statement from the subdivision board, carefully worded, of course, talking about miscommunication and ongoing discussions. What they didn't include was any admission of fault. But by then, it didn't matter. Once something like that gets out, people start asking questions, and not just the ones directly involved. That's when the shift really happened. It wasn't loud, not at first, but you could feel it. Cars started pulling into the subdivision at odd hours, not residents, but potential buyers, real estate agents, people walking through homes that suddenly had a very visible problem sitting right behind them. It's hard to sell the idea of peaceful, upscale living when the centerpiece of your community looks like a drought zone, especially when there's a story attached to it. I saw one couple walk out of an open house, stop near the fence line, and just stare at the yard for a long minute before shaking their heads and getting back in their car. They didn't even try to hide it. A few days after the news segment, Dana came back. This time she knocked. Not loudly, not aggressively, just enough to be heard. When I opened the door, she didn't step forward right away. Just stood there, hands clasped in front of her, like she'd rehearsed this version of herself on the drive over. "We'd like to make this right," she said. I leaned against the doorframe, waited. "The board is prepared to cover the full cost of replanting the trees," she continued, choosing her words carefully. "Mature replacements, not saplings. We've also agreed to compensate you based on the arborist valuation, and we're willing to formalize a long-term water usage agreement. Fair monthly rate, legally binding, no more assumptions." I let that sit for a second, not because I didn't understand it, but because I did. This was the part where most people would nod, maybe negotiate a little, then call it resolved. Clean, reasonable, wrapped up in a way that makes everyone feel like adults again. "And the lawsuit?" I asked. "We'd ask that you withdraw it," she said. "In good faith." I couldn't help it. I smiled a little at that. Not out of amusement. Exactly. More like recognition. Because there it was, the expectation that once they offered enough to fix the visible damage, everything else would just go away. Good faith, I repeated quietly. That's an interesting phrase. Her expression tightened, just slightly. "We're trying to resolve this without dragging it out further." I pushed off the doorframe, stepped out onto the porch, closing the door behind me. The air felt warmer than it had been the past few days, dry in a way that matched everything else. You know, I said, looking past her toward the road. My dad used to make deals on a handshake. Trusted people to follow through because it was the right thing to do. That's how you all ended up with water in the first place. She didn't interrupt, just listened. And maybe that works, I continued, when both sides respect what's being shared. But that's not what happened here. I met her eyes again, steady. You didn't just cut down trees, I said. You walked onto my land, made a decision about something that wasn't yours, and expected there wouldn't be consequences. That's not miscommunication. That's entitlement. There it was again, that pause. Longer this time. So no, I said finally. I'm not withdrawing anything. Not yet. Her shoulders dropped just a fraction. Then what happens now? I glanced out toward their side one more time. The dry ground. The empty space where something used to bring people together. Now just a reminder of how quickly things can unravel. Now, I said, you wait. Same as I am. Let the process play out. She nodded slowly, like she didn't have much choice in the matter, because she didn't. Then she turned and walked away, quieter than before. Weeks passed after that. The lawsuit moved forward, paperwork, evaluations, all the slow, methodical steps that turn a situation into something official. The water stayed off. They brought in temporary solutions, trucks, portable tanks, things that kept parts of the yard from completely collapsing, but never enough to restore it. Not really. And over time, you started to see the cracks spread beyond the grass. A couple of houses went up for sale. Then another. Turns out, that perfect sunset view loses some of its charm when everything beneath it is dry and uncertain. I still sit on my porch most evenings. Still drink my coffee, though now it's usually cold by the time I finish it. The sky is wide open these days, nothing blocking the light. Some people would call that an improvement. I don't. Because here's the thing. I didn't win anything. Not really. The trees are still gone. The land feels different. Quieter in a way that doesn't bring peace, just space. And maybe that's the part people don't talk about when they hear stories like this. They want a clean ending, a clear winner, someone to point to and say, that's the right side. But it's not that simple. So I'm curious, if you were in my position, what would you have done? Would you have taken the deal, turned the water back on, let it all go? Or would you have done exactly what I did and let them sit with the consequences? Let me know in the comments. And if you've ever seen a situation where one small decision spiraled into something much bigger than anyone expected, stick around. Because I've got more stories like this, and trust me, they don't always end the way you think.